Hey/X/, I've lurked for a while, and after some consideration I wanted to write out what happened to me some years ago, hoping it would be therapeutic. Well, I ended up spilling my guts out onto the page, figured I'd share it. I'm going to be lazy and just copy-paste. Attached is a photo of my doggo and guns I brought. This is probably the most fucked up thing I have or will ever experience in my life, but I'm finally able to gather my cojones and write down what happened. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and just to clarify, I live east of the Cascades, so it's not the lush wet forests people tend to think of, but instead dry and full of big ponderosa pines with sparse undergrowth. This happened a few years ago in spring, when after a cold long winter I wanted to get out and explore. I'm not very experienced with bushcraft, but I've been camping before and I'm not a fat ass, so I was confident I could pull off a simple backpacking trip in the mountains north of where I live. Even though I've been up there a few times, I still took my Kel-Tec Sub 2000 with, and my lever action 12 gauge with 10 shells alternating shot and slugs. As for companionship, I took my German Shepherd Saxon with me. He's young but is a pretty tough dog, and he'll kill anything smaller than him without hesitation, and he could definitely hold his own if a coyote got a little too bold. Fuck, the teeth and jaws on that dog are just scary. So, we take off, and about an hour later I park my truck at the foot of the hills, ruck up and Saxon runs out. Hills/mountains are beautiful and the weather is perfect. I put on my favorite leather western hat. I know, cringe, but it felt right with my shotgun, and we step off into the wilderness. Dis gonna be fun, boys. I planned on heading north for a few days, then loop back around using the Forest Service road as a handrail if I get lost. First couple days are absolutely uneventful. We saw a couple of deer and spooked a few grouse, but nothing all that exciting. Wake up early on the last day before turning around and the mountains feel totally uninviting. Not like they felt totally inviting in the first place, but that's the best way I can describe it. Like when you're at a party and you don't know anyone and your friend says he's on his way, so you just force a smile and you act like everything is fine. Saxon also seemed different too. He appeared more focused but not on a specific spot, like if he was hunting a rat or after seeing a stray cat. I clip his leash on him and figure I'm just working myself up because I've never been out this far, and Saxon is just picking up on my anxiety. It was sometime around midday when we were making our way to the top of the next ridge before we turn around when the unease came back and made me stop in my tracks. And no, there wasn't a smell, voices, or pentagrams in trees, just that same damn feeling. Saxon also looked on edge. And now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think he ever relaxed that whole time. He still looked around like regular, but he didn't have that dopey tail-wagging demeanor a dog out in the woods have looking to mark the nearest tree. But instead he stuck to me like glue and held his head low, like after I yell at him when he gets in the trash. I know I'm focusing a lot on my dog, but I never realized this until now, and I feel really dumb for being so oblivious. We were starting to near the top of the ridge when we began to enter a snow field. I know it was spring, but it still gets cold up there, and it was a tough long winter. The mud was thick and heavy, which made for some incredibly slow going and stank of decay, but when we hit the snow we cleaned the mud off our boots/paws the best we could and hurried to the summit. The closer to the top we got, the trees became far and few between, causing the snow to become almost blinding. Finding a tree, we took a break and I fished around in my pack for my sunglasses. As I was doing so, Saxon was transfixed on me, thinking he was going to get fed. As soon as I felt the lenses of my sunglasses, I began to pull them out, and that's when I heard what sounded like the shifting of weight in wet snow, that muffled kind of crunch. I froze, and Saxon's heavy, excited breathing stopped as he whipped his head around and looked downhill toward a cluster of scrawny, gnarled ponderosa pines. I held my breath and strained my ears, hoping to hear it again. Posting photo of Kel-Tec and mags. Nothing, just pure cold silence, except for the light breeze weaving through the pine needles. Saxon now was totally alert, with the hair on his back standing on end. The feeling of unease totally subsumed me and a shudder tore through my entire body. When I started my trip, I knew there were big cats, but they're so rare and skittish, I didn't think it would be a problem. I put my sunglasses away so I wouldn't obscure my vision and exchanged them for my Kel-Tec. As an aside, these little guns are so cool, they take Glock 17 mags and they fold in half so they're easy to store. So I snapped it into place and loaded a big 33 round mag into it and put the other 2 mags in my pocket. I released the charging handle and chambered a 9mm round. The sound of the bolt sliding home skid across the snow unobstructed into the valley below and echoed back. At first, I was reassured by the clack of the bolt, but the unnerving silence that followed brought with it the all-too-familiar uneasiness that defined the day. Saxon was now a bristling and tense ball of muscle and fur. I put my pack on, got a good hold of Saxon's leash, slung my shotgun, couched the butt of my Kel-Tec into my shoulder and trained it on the spot where we heard that crunch of snow. Slowly we ambled down the slope, making a wide arc, giving ourselves plenty of space between us and our new friend. Making it down to the snow line, I looked over and saw our muddy tracks when we first entered the field. But maybe 10 feet away there was another set of muddy tracks parallel to ours dissipating into the snow. That's when I knew without a shadow of a doubt I wasn't overreacting. Suddenly, Saxon puffs up again and is violently sniffing the air. All I smell is the putrid mud when it fucking hits me. And no, it wasn't that cliché metallic twang or blood and guts, but rather a musk or maybe stale piss. I only got one good whiff because after that, Saxon and I began to tear down the hill, first having to fight the thick clinging mud, and then scrambling down the loose basalt and soil hillside. I didn't dare look back, only focused on my feet, Saxon, and where my gun was pointed. I don't know if the sound of shifting rocks behind us was caused in our haste, but I really didn't want to look. Finally, we made it into a draw of the ridge, Saxon panting but his head on a swivel, and me out of breath wanting nothing more than to shit, piss and vomit all at the same time. I knew I had to find a road and use it to escape this terrifying new existence I found myself in. We continued down into the valley where eventually we would find a service road. Sorry folks, after posting I wanted to get pretty drunk so I could maybe sleep. If there's genuine interest I'll post the rest, but I don't want to just shout into the ether. The feeling of terror was dissipating, but the urgency of escape was still there. At this point, daylight was waning, and the mountains can obstruct the sun further. Fortunately, Central Washington has a unique geology and we found ourselves next to a cliff of basalt columns and an open field in front of it. I got a bonfire lit and after feeding Saxon and gnawing on some jerky I sat against the cliff, racked a shell in my shotgun and double-checked my carbine. Next thing I remember was waking up to Saxon right next to me, snarling in the dim light of the fire. I frantically scanned my surroundings and my blood froze as I saw 2 yellow/green pinpoints of light in the distance. They weren't all that high off the ground, but when that smell hit me, I instantly knew this was our friend. I slowly drew up my shotgun, but I had a sickening realization that the double-aught buck might just piss it off compared to a slug, and I wasn't going to look away and grab my carbine. So, we entered a staring competition in the dying firelight. Every so often it would try and approach, but Saxon would just bark his head off and the eyes would slowly retreat. I couldn't tell you how long we played this game until the faint little fingers of light began to fan out from behind the ridge in front of me. And with that meager amount of light, I finally saw, or at least saw, the silhouette of it. And fuck me 7 ways to Sunday, the outline wasn't anything like a big cat. Instead of the squat form of a cat laying down to stay low and hidden, I instead saw something that, although looked to be on all fours, looked too awkward to be in that position. Long wiry limbs were splayed out to the sides. The body was thin but deep like a racing dog's. But, the head, or at least the shape, is what fucking made my brain reboot. It was in that uncanny valley where it looked human, but just looked off. The best way to describe that initial sighting was like taking a child's drawing of a person where the general shape is there, but all the pieces that make a face human were missing. With the sun slowly rising, the eyes began to swivel around in an erratic, almost nervous way, and it began to retreat slowly. I know I said that its limbs looked awkward for quadrupedal locomotion, but fuck was I wrong. The most unnerving thing was the macabre gracefulness it was able to accomplish as it began to slink into the undergrowth. I finally broke out of my trance and squeezed the trigger on my shotgun. Boom! The noise was absolutely deafening after that silent hours-long standoff. The shot hit center of mass, causing it to reel up. At that point, blowing my fucking head off seemed smarter just then. Since I was sitting down, I knew I couldn't accurately tell how tall it was at that moment, but Christ, it seemed to tower over me just then. Just when the ringing in my ears was starting to fade, this thing began to scream? Howl? I don't know what to call it, but fuck was it loud, and still gives me the fucking heebie-jeebies. It was so much more shrill than I would have thought from something that size, but it was so raspy and had a gurgle to it. Unbelievably, it held that sound for what felt like forever as it looked straight at Saxon and I. We were immobilized as this thing let loose its pure animus towards the pain it must have found itself in. As this primal scream was ending, it trailed off into a low guttural moan or growl. Finding just will to move again, I ripped the lever down, ejecting the spent shell, and slammed the lever back, driving home the slug into the chamber, and almost simultaneously I pulled the trigger. I must have yanked on the trigger because the slug hit either its collarbone or shoulder. I couldn't really tell, because it seemed to have recoiled with that impact, spun, and leapt onto the nearest ponderosa, scrabbling at it like a squirrel. Last one for the night, folks, I'm gonna pass out and hopefully sleep. As it climbed, chunks of loose bark and dead pine needles dropped onto the bed of pine straw below. The slender form almost seemed to vanish in the maze of tree limbs. A bark or maybe a grunt could be heard as more scraping emanated from a tree further away as it retreated from view. I stood there fixated on the pines dimly illuminated when the whine from Saxon behind me almost made me jump out of my skin. He stood there, transfixed on the tree line too, but cowering behind me and shaking in fear. I couldn't blame him in all honesty, since I felt the exact same way.